we're looking at what practically happened in Brazil around the national minimum wage. And just briefly, in 7 years, from 2003 to 10, the Brazilians increased their national minimum wage by over 80% in real terms. Now, if you believe the conservative economists, that should have had a devastating impact on their employment. But what happened? They created 17 million formal sector jobs between 2002 and 2011. They reduced poverty by 20 million. And two-thirds of the fall in inequality in Brazil was attributed to this increase in wages. So they not only managed to massively reduce poverty and inequality in the society, but they used the minimum wage and increased economic consumption and development, combined with their industrial policy, to generate much greater labor-intensive growth in the economy. And we believe that that can be done in South Africa if we follow those examples. And the situation we confront in South Africa is that over half of South African workers live in poverty. According to Stats South Africa, over half of South African workers earn below 3,100 Rand a month in 2011, as opposed to a household subsistence level, which various university institutions and the Labour Research Services have spoken about at being at the very minimum about 4,000 Rand for a family of five. So you have the majority of South African workers working hard and long hours, many of them, but still living in poverty, and that's an absolutely unacceptable situation. While, as your listeners were saying, you have this huge disparity between those at the bottom and those at the top. So what we're really calling for is a national wage policy. We don't see that the national minimum wage is the only element of that policy, but it's a very important part of it because it sets a minimum wage floor, whereas currently we have many, many different minimum wages set by sectoral determinations, bargaining councils, etc., and many hundreds of thousands of workers not being covered by minimum wages at all. Well, the point about a national minimum wage is it's not supposed to set the actual wage levels in different sectors. What it does is it creates a floor. It's almost like a social protection measure. In Brazil, everybody in the country, regardless of which sector they work in, are entitled to a national minimum wage. The same thing is true in the USA and Australia and a number of other countries, in fact, the majority of countries in the world. And then what you have is sectoral bargaining, which, according to the conditions in the sectors and a number of other factors, set the actual wages above the level of the national minimum. And that's also done on a regional basis as well in a number of countries.
Look, I think we could certainly have a national wages policy, and I think that a national minimum wage would be part of that. I think that that's all a good idea, but we've got to be careful about thinking that the national minimum wage is economically costless if it's set at the wrong level. And I'd like to correct Mr. Coleman about Brazil. Brazil's minimum wage started to rise as the economy was booming and as it was heading towards full employment. So a lot of it was a natural rise anyway. And more importantly than that, the minimum wage was tied to an increase in social security. So it wasn't just the minimum wage that was rising. It was the wage for, it was what people were getting through grants and through Bolsa Familia and through pensions. The national minimum in Brazil is tied to its social security system. So it wasn't just wage-led growth. It was government transfers to the people that was also driving demand. And I think if we did that in South Africa, it would be a lot better. The question is trying to get income into the hands of poor people, not simply using the wage as an instrument to do that. The question really is the level at which we set that minimum, because if we destroy thousands of or millions of jobs, we'll be shooting ourselves in the foot.
Is that what happens if we raise the minimum wage?
It depends on the level and it depends on the sector. So Mr. Coleman very sensibly said we should have a national minimum at a floor and then the sector should decide. I agree. I mean, we've just got to be very careful about the floor. So, for example, we made a really big mistake, in my view, setting the agricultural minimum wage at its level, because instantly there were all these predictions we'd have thousands of job losses, at which point the minister then said, oh, you can apply for an exemption. I mean, that's bad policy. If you're going to have a floor, there shouldn't be a process to apply for exemption. We should be setting it properly so that that is absolutely the floor, and that we are, as a society, are happy with whatever job losses there are, and we have the social security to pick up those people who lose their jobs as a result. I mean, that's what our policy's got to be. We've got to provide the welfare for those that lose their jobs, and we must make sure that we don't lose too many jobs. Well, that's right. And every situation is different. I mean, I'd like to point out that one of President Lula's advisors, his economic advisors, was actually one of the people that helped write GEAR. So, here we have a left-wing economist who actually looked at the situation in South Africa back in the mid-90s and said, you can't just expand. So, whereas he was able to go in Brazil and say, well, this is a moment to do it. So you're right. We have to look at where are we now, and what's the best policy for us to be doing now, and what should the level of that minimum wage be?